Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today for this series of conversations. When Steve Engel introduced our last panel, he pointed out that this event, while happening in the Capitol, is so close to the Supreme Court. And I have to admit, even after a couple of decades in Washington, I'm always struck by the moment where you're standing either in front of the Capitol or in front of the Supreme Court, and you can see both buildings across from one another. And when I have people visiting from out of town, I always like to take them to that spot between the Capitol and Congress and say, look, here we are. On one side of the street, you see where all the laws are made, and on the other side of the street, you see Congress. I mean, it's important to keep in mind the difference between the three branches, as Judge Griffith pointed out, and that's really core to the work that we do here at the Gray Center, focusing on all three of these constitutional institutions and the important part they play and the importance of them not trying to play the other parts. And so that's informed so much of the Gray Center's work. It's also informed the work of our keynote speaker today, Ambassador C. Boyden Gray. You know him mostly, I suspect, for his work in the executive branch as White House counsel, for all of his work on regulatory reform in the Reagan administration, and then later as special envoy for Eurasian energy issues and as the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. But of course, in addition to that, he's had a career of service in and around the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, either working on cases or working on the hard work of getting judges confirmed. Before all of that, his work focused a lot on Congress. As a practicing lawyer in the 1970s at the famous law firm of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, he did so much work focused on what was happening in Congress in that era. And so it's interesting to see now at this point in his career, so much of his work focusing once again on Congress. And I know that firsthand from my own years of working with him at Boyden Gray and Associates, but now just as an observer, seeing his work in and around Congress. And so with his focus on all three branches of government, he really is the ideal keynote speaker for today's event. But I also want to say a word about Jen Mascott. She spent the morning introducing other folks, and nobody ever got a chance to introduce her. Jen rejoined Scalia Law a year ago after her own service in the Justice Department, working at the Office of Legal Counsel. She's worked with Justice Thomas and then Judge Kavanaugh as a clerk, and her own scholarship is focused on the separation of powers, especially in terms of the administrative state. Her arrival at the Gray Center really ushered in a new era of our work, sort of reaching out directly to folks on Capitol Hill, educating members of Congress in conjunction with Steve at the Article I venture, and then also in organizing the Gray Center Separation of Powers Clinic, which is overseen by Trent McCotter, who's here as well today. And so we're so proud of the work we're doing now, trying to connect ideas to actual governance, both through writings and through direct outreach like this. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jen.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thanks to you all for sticking with us, and thanks to the folks online. We now have a real treat to be able to hear from former White House counsel and Ambassador C. Boyden Gray, has held many roles and been involved in many ways around Washington, D.C., really as a star, a very influential attorney for decades, working with the institution of Congress in particular, and then also really being at the front seat of what was happening in the White House with the nominations process for Justice Thomas and many other judges. And so we just want to give Boyden a chance to talk really today about the institution of Congress and the courts, how they've changed over the years, and glean wisdom from your experience. So I guess I'll just start with a fairly open-ended question about how you see the institution of Congress in particular. Has it changed in the several decades since you've started working in Washington?
Of the three branches, it's undergone the greatest change of the three, no question. And it's not totally dysfunctional, but it doesn't provide the same output that it did for 200 plus years. What are the reasons for this? What are the indicia? Well, some of it's pretty nerdy, but one thing was airline deregulation, which lowered the cost of air travel, which made it possible for congressmen to sort of commute back and forth. That was later sort of codified by, I think, Gingrich as part of the money that they were paid. Part of their compensation was to include travel. And so it's like a 2 or 3 day work week. They don't have time to mix with themselves, really, let alone anybody else. And it's it's too bad that happens. Back when I first came here, senators were here, congressmen were here. They had good home stretches where they could go do politics, but their kids were in school here. They had to meet each other at parent-teacher meetings. There were no way to avoid each other, and there were friends across the aisle always. And then there were the great dinners that gave. There were about 6 great grand dames in Washington who gave these very fancy dinners led by Kay Graham, and you'd have Democratic and Republican senators there. And sometimes they go off in a huddle with a glass of brandy after dinner, and you'd be surprised what got decided. But that just doesn't exist anymore. And I, for one, went to a couple of Joe Ossopp dinners where he threw people out of his house, and that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore either. So there's a lot been lost there because of that. Then I think it was really Gingrich when he took the House, Republicans for the first time in 40 years. He started pulling more and more stuff into the Speaker's office, sort of bypassing the committees, and that's been followed by every majority leader and speaker since. Pelosi says, we got to pass legislation in order to find out what's in it, because the regular order doesn't exist. They don't have markups. They don't have floor debates, and it's I think kind of a tragedy. To give you one example, and I don't have all day, of course, but this one example I always remember as being relevant was the way we handled when I was doing work on the Hill for the Business Roundtable, which it's taken a slightly woke turn, but that's off the record. It was a very busy time, but there were no cell phones, and I had to take my instructions from a threesome of general counsel of 3 major companies that were running the roundtables process for these antitrust issues, Scott-Rodino, Illinois Brick. And I had to get briefed every 2 weeks, but in the middle, I was on my own because I had no way of communicating. So it was kind of heady for someone. I wasn't even 30 years old when some of this stuff was happening. But one of my favorite stories was working with Jim Allen, who was the master of the Senate rules. There's only one other body, some of you may know this, but I bet you most don't. There's only one other legislative body in the world that has the same rules as the Senate, where we're now sitting. And it's known as the rule of unanimous consent, basically, and that's the legislature of Alabama, and he was lieutenant governor for 12 years. So he knew the rules better than Byrd did, better than anybody did, better than the experts did. And he would, when there was this floor fight, I think it was on Hart-Scott-Rodino, I can't remember, he would place me up in the balcony. It's all illegal. Not illegal, but against the rules of the Senate. But no one seemed to stop me. And if he had a compromise that was being discussed, he would write the words on a piece of paper, and then he would look up at me and go like this. And I would wait, and sooner or later the paper would come up here, and it was compromise language, and I'd either go like this or go like this, and he'd say fine, and he'd go tell Mansfield, who was the majority leader. Mansfield finally figured out by triangulating that he was really looking at me. So he didn't wait for Allen to tell him. He just looked at me. And I can remember once looking at him and going like this, and him going like this. So that's the way things, but that was work, that was really work. And nobody left Congress on a piece of legislation not knowing what was in it, believe me. And one of the key issues was amendments to the third degree. Now, I suspect Judge Griffith knows this, but how many people here have ever heard of an amendment to the third degree? Well, nobody. See, that's the point. Amendment to the third degree is something that you can't do in markup sessions and on the floor, and it's sort of a shame that people have lost this fine art. So that's I think why Congress has kind of gone off the rails. It's really, a lot of it's just physical presence, and then there are a couple of other factors, spending too much time on this, a couple of other factors. One, I think identified first by Naomi Rao. I think some of the congressmen, after they lost the legislative veto in Chadha, sort of left things fuzzy or vague, so that the agency had to come back to them, and lobbyists had to come back to them to find out what the real answer was, and how to deal with it. And I thought that could be cleared up, because it was a little bit smelly, because, a lot of campaign finance money coming in. Private litigants had to have their visits to OMB or to the agencies logged. So I proposed to President Bush, when he was looking for material in 1991, as we're going into the election, I said, let's have all congressional contacts with the agencies logged, so we can trace what they're doing. And that seemed to be a good idea, except that once it was circulated within the White House, to show you how important this was, it took Quayle about 60 seconds to get in my office. He'd been in the House and the Senate, and he said, if you persist in this, I'll have to see that you are fired. So that was the end of that, and Congress doesn't have to log there, but that would be a big change. And I do think there's kind of lurking behind all this, a kind of legislative veto overhang to keep them in the game, because they lost the legislative veto. But it's a big shame, and I agree that one of the few ways that can get this is major questions and non-delegation, to throw out a couple of statutes to embarrass the Congress into actually getting back to work. But I think it'd be better if they spent more time in town and got to know each other, and go back to regular order, because that's what produces the best legislative product.
Well, that's great and very informative. And I know that you mentioned some of it is the change in leadership, with the leaders taking more control, the constitutional doctrinal development about legislative veto, folks being in town. I mean, have we lost that forever, though, with the amount of the cost of campaigns and having to go back home for election purposes? Or is there something that can be done, you think, here in town to encourage people to stay and do more work?
Well, I think you can look. I get this from my daughter, who may not be the best source, but she's a reporter, very good reporter, and she's talked to a lot of Congress people about this. And she says, you scratch any congressman, and you'll find that they don't really like being here, because there's nothing for them to do. Okay. There's nothing for them to do except make robocalls, calls to raise money, and they're not really included in the process. And so I think if they were more included in the process, their agencies were refunded. I think Gingrich led the fight to defund the Congress, and of course the agencies kept getting more and more funding. So now Congress kind of has to defer for expertise, and they shouldn't have to, since they hold the power of the purse. So that would make a big difference if they refund themselves and get the information they need to do what they need to do.
And could that be handled, you think, by increasing committee staff and legal staff and having more in-house experts?
Yes.
Absolutely. And so I know that you started your work on the legislative process in a kind of a private capacity, and then you were White House counsel. Can you just even basically tell us, as a White House counsel, what your main duties were, how you spent most of your day? And did you work much with Congress? Was it mostly on judicial noms, meeting with the president? What did that look like?
Well, I'd sort of say there were 4 buckets, still probably the same. Ethics, you're the sort of ethics officer, chief for the executive branch, and certainly for the White House. Judicial selection and confirmation, war powers, and then defending the power of the presidency, which is related, of course, to the other 3. I think that we were in the shadow still of Watergate, and the president was trying to get back some of what had been taken. Today, I think the presidency has too much, and I don't know what I would do, whether I would have if I were a counsel again in the last decade, whether I would have said to the president, no, this is going too far, you can't do this. I don't know whether I would have done that or not. But I'd like to think I might have, but I'm not sure. But that is an issue, and I hope future White House counsel will moderate what the president does and keep holding Congress to feet to the fire. I think that the issue I spent more time alone with the president, this might surprise people here, the thing I spent most time with him, and a lot of time, and he said, don't talk to the Department of Justice, there's no comment on Barr, but don't talk to the Department of Justice, they'll leak. and I want you to do it. You got a smart enough staff. And that was over war powers. That was over, which was the first time Congress had actually voted since World War II. And he thought it was very important to do so. It was a huge fight over whether we do it or whether he could get them to do the vote. And when the vote occurred, it was extremely close. But Congress or Senate, the Senate never looked better, in my opinion, than the debate over that issue. It was really, really elegant and high level and civil. And so that was the issue I spent the most time with him. And I'm afraid that we've let that get away, and Congress has really got to reassert its central congressionally delegated, this is really delegation, by the Constitution to the Congress to exercise its war powers responsibilities.
So you mentioned, at least on the war powers, not talking as much to DOJ, but I do find this interesting because we had, of course, two former heads of the Office of Legal Counsel.
I know.
earlier
Steve's
today.
probably going to say, what in the hell? No,
No, my question is just, well, so could you talk, I mean, is there anything more you can say generally about at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, what the dynamic was between the White House Counsel's Office and the Office of Legal Counsel? If you talked about other issues, or, how the legal advisors all came together.
So repeat that. I'm not sure if.
Well, did you work closely with the Office of Legal Counsel?
Of course I
other
did. Of
issues?
course I
What
did.
did that look like?
And again, telling too many stories, but they are good illustrations. The question came up, about the vote. Should there be a vote? And the president decided, and I have a picture in my house of Scowcroft and me and the president, and he's talking on the phone to Baker, but when the photograph was taken, but he's going to tell Scowcroft that he's going to reject his advice not to ask Congress and accept my advice that he had to ask Congress. And that was decided over a weekend of letters. He actually typed up the letters himself to Congress. It Camp David, and he went out first thing Monday morning. Then Sununu comes back, the chief of staff, and gets wind that something's going on, so he calls an all-lawyers meeting with the Attorney General and its legal advisor and the Joint Chiefs. Everybody was there, Justice Department, of course. And it was sort of a sham because the decision had already been made. And about a half an hour later, after everybody left, Ludig calls me from OLC, Mike Ludig, and Judge Ludig, and he says, "Oh, you gotta come. I gotta come down and see you. It's going to be a constitutional revolution if we don't ask Congress for authority." And I said, "Mike, just relax. You don't have to come up here. It's been decided. The letters already went out 3 hours before the meeting took place, so don't worry about it." Anyway, so
Did that make him feel better or worse?
did that make who feel better?
Judge Ludig.
Ludig felt much better, but I think he was suspicious, because he was very worried,
That's great.
But
Well,
I channeled him pretty well when I.
That's great. Well, I know one other high-profile development that's still impacting the court today, actually, that happened during your tenure as White House counsel, was the nomination and confirmation of Justice Thomas, 30-year legacy on the court, and you remain good friends with him. So I wonder if there's anything you can say about your role in, his selection and getting him across the line. At the time, would you and the president have anticipated that he would have the significant role on the court that he's had today?
Well, I think all of us who were involved knew this was a real home run, and knew that there was going to be opposition, because parallel to this, you have a question maybe about legislation during the Bush years, but there was legislation pending called the 1991 Civil Rights Act that nobody's ever heard of, and it dealt primarily with the issue of quotas. Bush had to veto the bill and sustain it by one vote in order to get that quota provision out before he signed it into law. And but that was parallel to the Thomas nomination, and the three senators, Metzenbaum, Simon, and Kennedy, who were on Judiciary, who were also on Labor and Education, which oversaw Thomas's work at Education and at EEOC. They knew his views about preferences, and I think that's why they were most determined to try to stop him. And they leaked the FBI report of the Anita Hill interview, and it was really ugly. But President Bush anticipated it. I wasn't there, but I've been told. He told me what happened. He pulls the nomination is made up in Kenny Bunkport. He pulls him into his bedroom, and he says, "I wasn't there." He says, "This is going to be a really, really rough ride for you and me, Judge, and I'm going to stick with you if you stick with me."
Great.
And it was wonderful, but it was not easy. D.C. Circuit was easy, and it was very important because every single one of the judges, including the most liberal probably then Judge Mikva, was solidly behind him, and that was a critical component of his confirmation. We didn't want to have any naysayers, but there were no naysayers, and after it was all over, Breyer would say to me, because they sat next to each other for a long time, given how slow they were to have nominations come through, he used to say to me when I'd run into him at something or other, he used to say to me, "That lovely, lovely man, how could they have done that to that lovely, lovely man?" So the Supreme Court is a lot more difficult than the D.C. Circuit.
Absolutely. And what do you think now, looking 30 years back at his service, his most important legacy?
Well, I think it's still being played out, but I think it's his spotting very early on, as early as 20 years ago, in American Trucking. He writes a concurrence, I guess, or maybe it's a concurrence saying, "I think it's time we look at the non-delegation doctrine because of the breadth of the and vagueness of the delegations going to the agency." So he spotted that, more than 20 years ago, and he's now been, now I think there will be a majority to begin to really build on the Grundy opinion and, really break some eggs.
Do you anticipate that a majority of the justices will be willing to apply the doctrine to find a statute or parts of it unconstitutional in the near future, this term? What is your thought?
Well, I'm not sure it'll happen this term, but I think it's going to happen. And that may be more wish than prediction, but there's signs all over the place, and in opinions and things people say, justices say when they're making speeches. There's a lot of chatter about it, has been for the last 2 or 3 years, and I think it's going to happen.
And do you have a thought about what tests the court should apply? Do you think they'll just apply the intelligible principle doctrine and find that there are statutes that don't satisfy that test? Or do you think there will be a majority around a particular standard for how to evaluate how detailed a statute needs to be?
Well, I think it's going to be a common sense thing, and I think if you read Gorsuch's opinion and Gundy, I think that sets out a pretty good test. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some years to refine. I think it's got a lot more, that decision and the precedent has a lot more Panama refining and Schechter and cases later, American Trucking, and the major questions cases. I think there's a lot more there than Justice Stewart and, obscenity. You know it when you see it. I think it's going to be a lot more precise than that, but it's not going to ever be probably a black letter, that you can write on a bar exam and expect to get a 2-word answer, yes or no, 1-word answer.
Yeah, no, that's a good description. And I mean, I know you mentioned that if a statute is found to be unconstitutional in part, maybe that'll embarrass members, make them feel like they have to legislate. Do you think that alone will be enough, or are there certain institutional problems, like we talked about on some of the earlier panels, with members of Congress not wanting to pay the political cost of reaching agreement in detail, that will still almost make the institution incapable of acting?
I hear this all the time. They want to punt because they don't want to take on the serious issues. I just don't believe that's true. I think they do want to participate. I think they do want to legislate. And I think, as I said earlier, that many of them, if you scratch, if not a majority of them, don't like it because they are cut out of the action. So I think a couple of things would be helpful. There could be, Congress might have to adopt these restrictions, but there could be a revolving door restriction, like the revolving door stuff that is occasionally put in and then ignored in executive orders for the executive branch. But congressmen ought to have a cooling off period of maybe 2 years before before they go in and start lobbying, as many congressmen stick around for in this town. And I think that I would like to see, and I know this is really provocative, but being in charge of ethics for the executive branch, there are very strict rules of recusal. I know it's come up about the court briefly. I didn't hear all of it. And I don't want to address that because that's a separate issue and really not the same. But for Congress, I don't know why you couldn't have a rule that if a congressman or senator takes, pick a number, 20,000, 30,000, but it can't be 5, that's too small, takes that much money from an industry or a company in donations, that they are disqualified from voting on anything that involves that company. And that would get people's attention, wouldn't it? But I don't think they'll do it. But I think that would help.
So instead of just folks around town talking about applying some of the executive branch ethics rules to the court, maybe applying them to Congress, do you think there are other requirements that are applicable to the executive branch, like Freedom of Information Act, that Congress should also consider applying to itself so there's more transparency?
Well, I think if they follow the way they behaved and acted for most of our history, that's enough. That's enough transparency, because it's everything they do is put down into a word in some form or another, and you have to listen to the reasoning for it or against it and the arguments for or against, so it's fine. I don't think there's a need to do any more than that.
And how about the institution of the court? So we also talked, panelists, a lot this morning about calls around town to reform. Had co-director of the center was a member of the President's Supreme Court Reform Commission, Judge Griffith. How do you see the institution of the court having changed since you were White House counsel, did the nomination of Justice Thomas with the president, and now as an observer around town litigating a lot in the courts? How's the Supreme Court changed fundamentally, or has it?
Well, it has changed enormously, but not in terms of its core mission. I don't think it's changed that much. And, Justice Thomas himself kind of gave hint to that. In the 11 years he talked, I suppose I was in between various nominations, but no, I don't think the core mission has changed. I don't know what this leak's going to do, and I don't really want to talk about it because I think it was well aired in your panels this morning. But yeah, there's probably 2 or 3 big changes. One is they take about maybe a little more than half of what they used to take when I was clerking. And they have twice as many clerks now as they had when I was clerking. I mean, I was thinking about it in the car coming here that I think there were 21 or 22 of us is all. And 7 of us had been in the same college class, which I think is really quite extraordinary when you think about it. But there were only 21 or 22, and there were fun times when the Hong Kong flu came through, and Justice Stewart he was a big Yale, had tickets on the Yale side of the Harvard Stadium. He invited, because his son got the Hong Kong flu, so he invited his clerks. They were both married, didn't want to come without their wives. I was one of the single law clerks, so he picked me. We went, and it was wonderful for me. That was the game where, as the Crimson said, Harvard won 29-29, and he was so dismayed. When we got up after the game was over, because he had been waving his handkerchief too, like all the other Yale's, and boom, it's a 29-29 tie, and he wheels around and look, Dowling and Hill, they've never lost a game in high school in Ohio, and now they're like Damon and Pythias. This is the first time they've ever lost. And I said, but you didn't lose, Mr. Justice. It was a tie. And he looked at me and he said, no, you won. And he wheeled around and walked out. And he always would avoid me in the hallway when I would walk along, and he sort of, it took a month for him to speak to me again.
That's great. Well, I mean, I know you say,
but I will add that there are. I'm telling too many stories, but this is the one of the pleasures with a smaller law clerk group is you could park in the parking lot with where the justices were parked, and the prequel to this is that the chief had asked me to teach a course to the guards, the police, about the latest developments in criminal law, criminal procedure, of which there were a lot back in those days, and so he had me teach this course, three sessions, and there was a law clerk many of you may know him, some of you may have studied under him, or with him, taught with him, Bruce Ackerman, who was very liberal, clerking for the most conservative justice, Justice Harlan, and he audited my classes in order to make sure I wasn't, stretching things, I being conservative in his view. And later, after this was over, it was spring, beautiful spring, driving up the ramp, and the tableau in front is the cars in front of me blocking the ramp, and the door opening, somebody getting out, and across this is a guy with a purse in his hand running, and a Supreme Court guard trying to tackle him, and a little old lady way behind screaming, "He's got my purse, he's got my purse." And so I'd have to come to a stop, and what's happening in front of me is someone getting out of the car. It's Bruce, and the poor cop is still struggling to tackle this guy, and he's screaming with his arms, "Give him his warnings! Give him his warnings!" Anyway.
That's great. That's very interesting. So they definitely have, they definitely have fewer cases on the docket now, more law clerks. I think the takeaway earlier today was the institution is strong. Do you think that there needed to be a Supreme Court Reform Commission? What do you think are you willing, or do you have thoughts on what was motivating President Biden to try to have such a commission and whether it was necessary?
Oh, I don't know what motivated him. I mean, I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know. But a lot of Democrats and liberals thought that the confirmation process was not fair and whatnot. I just point out to people that President Bush, 41, nominated Justice Roberts to the D.C. Circuit in January of 1991, and he never got a hearing, let alone a vote. So that's for the D.C. Circuit, not the Supreme Court, not the same thing, but not too far different. So this is the way politics works, and I think that's what motivated it. But I don't think there needs to be any reform. I think packing would be a terrible idea, and I think both Ginsburg and Breyer have said as much. So I think that would be a big mistake.
That's great. Well, you've been very generous to share a lot of stories with us. Would it be okay to see if there's a member or two of the audience who might have
Sure.
a question on these issues? Great. So do we have the mic? We've got.
There's one thing I want to say while you're doing the mic. How has the court changed? Well, one thing is it's not doing a lot of the criminal procedure stuff. The other thing, and the big thing, is it's not spending so much time on pornography. And this was a big problem, and it was something that the chief felt felt to be very important. He came from a Scandinavian background, and they're kind of prudish, and so he didn't want community standards violated, and it's of course impossible. Justice Stewart, I know it when I see it. It was impossible to define, and Douglas didn't like the issues, and he would always put the offending material, if it didn't come out right, in the appendix to his opinion or dissent. So it all kind of leaked out anyway. And there were movies every Wednesday. There were movies for the docket, for the conference on Friday. And I'm told that Justice Marshall, we weren't allowed to go. That's how the Chief Justice was so careful about it. He wouldn't let us go. But all the other law clerks piled in, led by Justice Marshall, who sat in the front and clapped his hands and thighs. And later, when Bush was president, and he invited the court and retired members to Camp David, Justice Marshall was too frail to go out and ride around in golf carts and stuff. So that was sort of a group that was rotating to talk to him. And when it came my turn, I said, "Well, Mr. Justice, tell me about those movies, because we were never allowed to go, those pornographic movies." And he said, he had a wonderful Southern accent. He said, "Boyden, there were no pornographic movies." And I said, but I'm told you I know they were held. There were no pornographic movies. And it took me, another 30 seconds to realize he wasn't saying there were no movies. He was just saying they weren't pornographic.
Okay. Oh, well,
Anyway, I'm sorry.
no, that's great. No, that's good. I've never heard that anecdote, so that's very good. And I don't want to drill down too much on that, but thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that with us. Could we get so I think Jess Braven had a question, is that right?
Yeah. Just one question. You mentioned you clerked. Thanks. You clerk for Chief Justice Warren. You mentioned Bruce Ackerman clerking for Justice Harlan. Examples of justices picking clerks who may not share their exact approach on the law. We don't seem to see that now. We see a lot of clerks who are selected almost prepared for the position by being ideologically tested. Do you think that's a good or a bad development? I mean, would you have preferred to clerk for Justice Harlan, for example? Or is it better to have consistency among the clerks or some diversity of views within each chamber?
Well, I think that may have changed since, I was known to be a conservative, but still I was, no one ever bothered me about it. And Harlan was the most conservative justice, and I think Bruce was the most liberal clerk. So there was a mix that the justices kind of enjoyed, and I think that's kind of disappeared a little bit, but maybe unavoidable.
And do we have one more? Yeah.
Ambassador Gray, you mentioned your comments on the legal situation, various formats, issues to Congress with war powers. I wonder what you would think is a way to obtain a settlement to the current crisis with Ukraine and Russia. Is there anything on the drawing boards that might make sense? They were able to obtain an armistice with North Korea and all of the United Nations involvement, all the nations involved. There was a way to end the crisis. Do you foresee anything like this in this situation?
I don't. I kind of hope that, this is a personal, and I'm not in any position of authority over something like this. I do hope there's a resolution because there's a lot of trouble, a lot of suffering that's going on that doesn't need to, and the suffering is not just limited to Ukrainians and Russian soldiers. It's spread, because of food, connections and energy. So I think it should be settled. But I'm not, I don't think I've ever been exposed to trying to find some international way of doing this. I think it's got to be the United States, and China's going to play a role, and Russia and Ukraine and the European Union. So I think between them, they can get it done if they really want to.
That's great. Thank you. So we are just about at time, and I really want to thank you for coming and see if you have any closing thoughts. But what I love and just want to point out, I think, which was a really interesting, critical thing that you said early on that gets to a lot of what we were talking about at this conference with separation of powers, is challenging the thesis that, today the members of Congress are gone just because they want to win elections and there's no hope. And you're suggesting actually it's the opposite, that they're gone because they don't have as much to do here, because there's been a centralization of control, the loss of the ability to have the legislative veto, but perhaps if there is a ramping up in expertise or a reinvigoration of Congress and staff, maybe that will help. And I think that's an interesting point, and perhaps was shied away from, as you suggested, by Speaker Gingrich and those in the past, because the thought always was corruption, we don't want too much power. But I do wonder if because in the last 3 decades, administrative agencies in the executive branch have taken so much power, if now folks will sort of reconsider and see the dynamic is such that Congress needs to reassert itself to get rid of the perhaps more dangerous wolf, which is the unelected folks in other branches making decisions, and if certain court opinions will force their hand, because you say maybe the court will relook at delegation. We had an interesting opinion last week coming out of the Fifth Circuit, essentially finding that Congress has not given the Securities and Exchange Commission anywhere near enough standards to know whether it needs to do in-house adjudication or go to the courts. And so there really does seem to be a demand from many different corners calling for Congress to take more action. And so maybe we can all together think about possible solutions. So on that, is there any parting words for the conference that you would like to share?
Well, I felt kind of useless coming up here after the previous panel, which was very good. I got to listen to that for another 45 minutes. And I'm sorry to kick you off, you guys, because you were doing great. So, no, I think it's a combination of things. There's no one cause, but it is critical. They do make friends if they're on the same committees, but they don't have the same breadth of vision about who else is in Congress, what's going on. So I do think if they got to spend a day or two more in Washington, frankly, and make up for it. It's okay to lengthen the home time they might get, more vacation time or whatever. But I think the concentrated time is necessary to work through some of the difficult issues. And I can remember all the, in many ways, sort of the last great sort of congressional operation was the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, when I can remember 2 or 3 all-nighters in the majority leader's office here in the Capitol, and there were incredibly detailed discussions that were held. Dingell did a wonderful job. He never would delegate any more discretion to the EPA than he absolutely had to, which is not an attitude you hear much today anymore. But it was a hard-fought thing, but it passed with large majorities, and it's been very stable. And that, I think, is the key thing to remember, that only Congress can provide for a truly political issue. Only Congress can provide the stability and the lasting power to make this thing acceptable to the country at large. And they've really got to get back in the game and got to get back to regular order, got to pass different appropriations bills, they got to regain their power of the purse, they got to stop creating things like the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which is funded by the Fed and not by Congress. And when the previous head went to, he didn't have to attend any Senate or House hearing because they didn't have any power over him anyway. But he did go. He did accept some invitation to speak. And a member of the House Financial Affairs Subcommittee said, who was in charge of this rather lavish $200+ million renovation of your offices? And Cordray's answer was, and this was more insubordinate than I ever was to my parents or any of my teachers, he said, what does it matter to you?
Well, I guess that's, yeah, put
So
a
on
fine
that
point on
note-
it. That's great, thank you.
Great.